So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Barry Cranford. I'm one of the organisers of the London CTOs. I'm not a CTO myself. I run a tech recruitment company called RecWorks. So we've been on a mission at RecWorks for the last 12 years to prove that recruitment can be a force for good in the tech industry, beyond just getting people jobs, and that's specifically around learning and mentoring. So put simply, if we've got people that want to learn from other people and people that are happy to share, then we're happy to put everyone together. And that's on a group basis like today, or on a one-to-one level. And in fact, I could do with, if there's anyone here that is happy to help to work with more junior CTOs, then I'd love to hear from you. So Meet and Mentor is one of the biggest examples of what we do. We've made over 2,500 introductions there. And that's everyone from students all the way up to CTOs. So if you can help, if you're happy to help, please let me know. And as I mentioned, we've also got groups there for aspiring CTOs and aspiring interim CTOs. It's all powered from recruitment, so we don't make any money from anything that we do other than recruitment. So if anybody is hiring, then please do let me know. Anyway, on to today. So it's a roundtable, so please do get involved. Chuck in your opinion on anything you'd like to, ask questions. If you can, please turn your cameras on. It's always much better if we can see people at the table, and where possible, keep your mics off. If you want to get involved, if you want to talk, the best way I've found, it shouldn't be too much of a problem with the numbers that we've got today, but the best way we've found so far is just to unmute your microphone and I can see who's unmuted and invite you in. Cool. Okay, so today's event is going to be around the good, the bad, and the best. So how you guys draw the lines between tech talent, what looks good, what looks bad, and obviously what's the best there. We're going to be looking at three main areas. So that's what it looks like. Like I say, how do you draw those lines, how to attract it, and how to screen for it. And then when we're done with the questions, we'll go into breakout rooms. So I'm going to throw a question out there. And anybody can jump in. So first things first, what do you love to see when you're hiring for tech talent? And I think developers being the big one here. What is it you love to see? What is it you look for?
Yeah, I've unmuted. Sorry, my touchpad doesn't seem to be very sensitive. Actually, I'll let Alex in while I'm at it. Ever since I installed the driver, it's not been too sensitive. What would I like to see? I think actually Adam, weirdly, we're speaking about this here today. I'm pointing at Adam because he's in that direction. More than anything else, I like to see mind, the thought process and the culture fit. So I'm one of these people that basically believe you can pretty much teach anybody anything, but you find it difficult to teach people how to think in a potentially logical way, or to have them fit with your culture. So one of the things I tend to do in interviews, that Crawley in as well, one of the things I try to do is go through some sort of scenario. So, preamble in an interview, blah, 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 this is what we're doing, tell me about yourself, and then use the information I've had back to try and plug gaps. So build a scenario, go through the scenario, see what they come back with. There's no right or wrong answer. It's just basically trying to get an idea of how that person thinks. That's all I've got to add.
Okay, great, thanks. Anybody else want to weigh in with an opinion on that? What they love to see? Yeah, John.
I was just going to ask for a bit more detail around the kind of scenario.
So it's and this is going to sound really, really bad. It really, really depends on the role or requirement and the progress of the interview. I generally build the scenario to try and bridge any gaps in anything I haven't heard. So it's quite difficult because you've got a paper CV, you read through it and you go, yeah, I've got some skills and all the rest of it. But that doesn't really tell you much about thought process, logical thought process. It just tells you basically what the guy might have achieved before and what skills they might have. And that's all subjective anyway. And then when you get somebody to reply back to you, basically to talk about themselves, they might not necessarily know. They might have something, some attribute you're looking for, but not actually offer it as part of when they actually talk about themselves. So it's generally a scenario just to basically go through, relates to both the purpose and the gap, and then try and get an idea of how the person thinks. So it's generally a problem style scenario. It'll be something that I've just thought up, and it'll be there's no right answer. It's just seeing how that person goes about dealing with that scenario. Now that's apparently not a favourite for most HR departments, but it's one of the things I use to try and figure out how a person thinks and what their cultural fit might be.
Problems of that is that it's very easy for it to go wrong. It takes a lot of skill to do it well at all, as a high threshold before you can even do it at kind of a mediocre level of your own skill. And even when you can do it, there's a lot of situations. So a particular candidate or a particular role or a particular speed of hiring where it just isn't going to work. And my worst example I've experienced was in an interview at Google, where the interviewer at one point just said to me, "Look, stop answering the question I'm asking." And I looked at him and went, "What?" And he went, "You know the question I really mean. Answer that one instead." And I just thought, oh God, this is an interviewer who really needs a lot more training. And the number one piece of training should be stop doing scenario interviews when you aren't really qualified and trained in how to do them.
And I will definitely back that up, Adam, because I've seen some horrific instances of this as well when I've been sitting with heads of IT, CTOs, CIOs, who've actually tried to do a similar thing and they've completely failed. I think you have to be I'm trying to think of the word. I think you have to be quite emotionally intelligent when you go through this as well. You don't want to put too much stress on the person. You're going for the scenario to try and get to a point of something you want to find out about the person. But Adam's right. I've been doing it for years, so I suppose, and it's been a natural progression. I can't remember a time where I completely fluffed it, as in tried to go for the scenario-based questioning and it's been a complete failure. But it does open, or if you're not comfortable in doing it, if you're not one of these sort of people that are willing to talk about philosophy with somebody else, I suppose, and go through general disagreement and are willing to explain why you think in a particular way, then don't try it. But if you are a person that, is willing to go through what their normal thought processes are and how they arrive to things and all the rest of it, then feel free. But yeah, I mean, coming back to what Adam was saying, it is quite a dangerous tool potentially.
I think the time when it's the fragility it has with specific candidates is that people exist on a spectrum of concrete rationalization versus abstract rationalization. And for, maybe 2/3 of that spectrum, the scenarios are fine. But for a third of that spectrum towards one end, they can't do it. They just, and I think the worst interviewers, it's because they can't do it. But even if the interviewer can, I've seen a lot of cases where the candidate is basically dying on their feet in public. They can't stand it because it's just not how their head works. And obviously, as you say, if you've got enough experience and emotional intelligence, you should be able to see that and stop doing it. And if you hire for particular kinds of roles, if you hire for particular kinds of roles, you might never see that kind of candidate because you might already be filtering them out because they don't fit the kind of person you're looking for. But I think in general, that's why it's not universally used, because it's so at a strategic level. If you adopt it as a strategy especially across multiple interviewers, such a high chance of it just exploding in your face. It doesn't mean it's a bad thing.
Can I just interject, because I'm not sure I'm understanding this. So I do a scenario with people, and usually I just throw out, I say, well, let's imagine everything's gone pear-shaped for the company. We have to pivot. I come to your desk on Monday morning and say, we're changing what we're doing some completely other thing. I need you to build this chunk of program. What do you do? And I deliberately leave it as completely vague, and just to understand how people jump into a completely new thing. Is that
No, I don't go that vague, to be honest, John. So okay. I tend to build a and say probably coming back to my normal day job is actually architect, so I am a conceptual thinker. But it's coming up with something that's probably got more detail around it, which is more relevant to the role or what you're actually trying to output from the role, and the gaps in that of what you've not actually seen from the person already. Now, if we come back to the particular example here, it's and really depend on the level here as well. But you've just basically gone from a very high level concept, which is businesses decided to pivot. Now, what you haven't done is come up with the reasons why the business is pivoting, or the economic conditions, or whatever condition might exist of why the pivot has happened, and the reason why the code would need to be produced. So this output has come about because of blah, all the rest of it. How would you go about it? And then it's actually the type of answer you want. So in terms of how I understood your scenario then, John, is you're actually looking for more of a prioritization style answer. So maybe the thought process is around how that individual would prioritize something, if they've been given different direction, maybe rather than another gap that might come up. And prioritization is a gap that comes up. And I'll go through one really poor example. And actually coming back to what Adam was saying, this person was starting to suffer a bit with a whole scenario-based question. And what I didn't get from that person was how they manage projects effectively. We're bringing them in as a PMO. So, we need to have an idea of how they perceive the flow of projects, the artifacts, all that sort of thing. And actually, I'm glad I went through the scenario-based question, because actually the person knew everything. It's just they understood it through completely different terms. So we were talking about stuff, but to them it wasn't translating, because in their previous organization, which was a very large bank, they'd worked to another framework, which had lots of different names for things. It was all interchangeable per se, but they didn't have an idea of whether they could do the job. So it was good to go through the process, because at the end, it's basically, so we've gone through the scenario, we noticed there's a bit of a translation problem, and you've now come up with everything I wanted to get out of this. So brilliant, it worked. But that person was really suffering because the things that we were saying weren't translating. So I had to adjust the scenario questioning and the scenario itself and what I was offering to try and get back the things that I was trying to get. So as I say, John, yours might work with a bit more detail if you were just trying to look for, let's say, prioritization. But I don't go in with static scenarios. I go in with the idea that I'm going to have to try and get the information I need to get out of a candidate. The way I do that is through scenario-based questioning. I'm not saying it's the best way, but I only build those scenarios on the back of what I'm missing, not on what I have.
I would.
Sorry, just to interject a bit.
Richard.
In terms of scenario questions, I mean, in my experience, and I heard quite a few people in a variety of companies, not everybody is that able to come up with responses on the spot to things that they don't know. Some people are better at taking their time thinking, and they have great ideas. They just don't do it on the spot. So I would imagine this is more of a scale, and at the beginning of the scale, the simpler questions that will still give you extremely good results are the STAR questions. If you're familiar with those, like situation, task, action, result, where it goes like, in your previous role, tell me a scenario a situation where you did something like that. And then you can dig into that and figure out how he accomplished it, and she, and then what were the results, and and so on. And then when you dig and you figure out if he did that by himself, or he was actually just a small cog in a big machine, and so on. And then the next level, where it's like people can think on their feet, you can go into the scenario-based approach, and you can go a level further. You can do live coding if you want, but some people are really stressed about that, obviously. So I would say live coding works for an individual that is very self-confident. You are maybe hiring a contractor who's doing this left, right, and center and has absolutely no worry. He's most likely, maybe he's a public speaker or someone who is extremely confident of himself, and that will immediately give you some insight. But of course, that is, in my opinion, a kind of a rough, tough interview, right? And then you might not want to do that all the time.
I completely agree. To the star point, by the way. So, and actually, I didn't really touch on that. When we do the whole talking thing around the CV, it is generally star related. I can't say that I would back the whole idea of a live coding exercise. I wouldn't put a candidate through that. I'm not saying it's wrong, by the way. I've never put a candidate through that, but I probably recruit for very different roles, to be fair. Sorry.
Can I tell you what I found really works with the coding? Is we mail out coding tests to people, and really, a variation on FizzBuzz, to be honest. I just say to people, just take as long as you want. Genuinely, I mean that. And then you see what you get back. And you get a huge range from people with nothing to people who've written loads of test code around it and benchmarked it and stuff. And you go like, yeah, that's great. But then what you do when they come in is you say, okay, you've written this code. Now I need you to modify it to do XYZ other thing as well. And I think that's much fairer because they know the code, they've written it, they're kind of into it, they understand what they're doing. It's much more constrained. And I think that really works. And actually once, honest to God, I had a guy aced the programming part, mailed it in, it was great, called him in for the interview, said, okay, modify it to do, so FizzBuzz is like 3 and 5. I said, do 7 as well. And he just died. And he said, well, actually, my friend wrote all this code for me.
So the key thing there, I mean, I always say, I love it when people do take-home tests because you're removing yourself from the gene pool of recruiters and you're making my life much easier because all the best candidates will just refuse to even speak to you and word gets around. But the main value of them when they are used, I've seen, is exactly what you just described. And it's very interesting you use FizzBuzz. It's not very rare, but it's certainly uncommon to use something that simple. And I think the key question is, what's your biggest fear? What's the problem? What's your kind of, in a security sense, threat model? And you've just highlighted it beautifully with that, well, my mate wrote it for me. And I think so a thing we used to see in game development a lot was people applying for jobs with 6-7 years of programming experience who couldn't write a single line of code at all. And there you do the take-home tests, and you do them as literally as something like FizzBuzz, and we'd say, this should take you no more than 5 minutes. If it takes you 10 minutes, please phone us first because it shouldn't be spending that long on it. If it takes you 15, you should be really worried, kind of thing. And it was literally just because a lot of people at that point would reply, actually, I can't code. And because our threat model was the vast number of people who were sending in completely fake CVs, so just total fabrication. But in most companies, we don't have that problem. And when we don't have that problem, the coding tests tend to be just negative. They have value, but the cost to them is enormous because of the number of candidates it drives away. So I'd be very interested in what extent you have a specific problem you're solving that, because it sounds like you're using it for 2 different things at the moment. You're using it as that filter on basic competence, but it sounds like you're also using it where you're allowing people to spend enough time to write unit tests. It sounds like you're also using it as a replacement for a big chunk of interview.
So it's just really interesting. I tell people take as long as they want. It shouldn't take them long, as you say. Literally, I say this should take you half an hour. Obviously, it shouldn't. It should be quicker than that. But you don't want to stress people out. I'm intrigued to hear you say people drop out because I've never had anyone do that. So I'm wondering if other people.
I fully agree there. A very good candidate will never do coding tests. Imagine everybody asking the same thing. A good candidate will apply easily to 10-20 jobs. They will not do 20 tests. Absolutely not. A mediocre candidate, as in not novice, but mid-level, right? They will probably do it. And to come back to the way of using this to filter things, it's all context related, right? If you have, if you're a very, very hot startup or a large corporate that has an amazing job, you're going to get tons and tons of candidates. And then, you need to filter things down somehow. And then you're going to put some, online coding test. You're going to put some homework. You're going to put some, people will drop out, but you have a large enough pool. At the end of the day, it's a pipeline. So you need to filter that out. You'll only hire one person, imagining you're only hiring one person, but yeah, sometimes you hire multiple. But if you are, a regular company who doesn't get tons of applications because, well, there is a bit of an imbalance in the market, we all know that, then obviously sometimes you get so few that you have to manually take care of every single person and, handhold them, have extensive phone interviews, which they usually start by you presenting the company and making the potential candidate really excited. It's not those kind of interviews where you jump straight into questioning people. Mm-hmm. So you have to adapt your stance based on the need and the kind of role or the company you're in. And this changes over time also with the company.
Andy and Corley, I see you've both had your mics off mute for a while there. Andy, did you want to jump in then? Corley, I'll come to you afterwards.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think this is fascinating, and I think just going back to the last comment really, which is it depends what you're interviewing for, and really the corporation or the place in which you are and how you can do that. So, I mean, I'm constantly recruiting, and I struggle to do so. I work in investment management. It used to be a destination of choice for technologists, and we're seeing now it's not. Fintech and startup is dragging people away from us. And really, how you go about that process. So I used to do online tests. I used to send them out. I used to do all that, and really came back to, well, what am I actually? Again, I think Adam was saying, what am I testing for? What am I trying to get out of that process? And each step of the way, we've kind of gone back and refined and really kind of been quite clear to ourselves, but also then to candidates at each step. What are we actually looking for from this part of the interview process? So we do have a technical interview, but it's consistent and it's the same. And it does go down into quite core, technology principles, kind of comp sci principles and things like that. But again, we're not asking people to test it out at that point and code out or anything like that. It's really getting to that. We just, again, can people stack up what they've put on their CV? What are they saying they do? On all of our interviews, I don't do scenario. I do a lot of STAR, which is really based on, you've written this stuff down. Talk to me about it. Tell me what you do. And I find, what are we trying to get out of that is, and so back to the question you asked, which is, what do I love to see? I love to see breadth. So a Java developer, I can go and get good Java developers, but people with breadth who think about the problem left and right. In my mind, do they think about the data and where it comes from? Do they think about, if they're writing a microservice, who's the user and how that might get utilized further upstream all the way to the UX? That's what I look for. That's what I get excited about. If I get a developer who is a core Java developer who thinks left and right of their problems, that's kind of what I interview for.
When you do this, so I have an objection to STAR, and a lot of people, again, I've seen a lot of great candidates just do very badly at it. But the main thing I've noticed while watching them be interviewed, normally as a co-interviewer, is that I know what the interviewer was looking for in the STAR thing, and the candidate doesn't. And so the candidate is desperately flailing around, and candidates get zero practice of this, unless it's their job, which in most people's case it isn't. You don't spend your life thinking about situations you've been in and filing them away for future use. And if you do, I probably don't want to work with you because you're a very strange, borderline sociopath. So it means a lot of the good candidates, and in fact, just a lot of candidates generally just really struggle with STAR stuff. But one of the things I've done that seems to make a big difference is give them the situation, but also now, the thing I'm really interested in your answer will be, like you were saying there, I'm looking for breadth, and I'd go into all the detail you just did. Say, look, I've had 20 other Java developers come forwards for this. What I didn't like about them was A, B, and C. So now go for it. Now, I just wondered, is that something other people do? Do you outline your things? And to cap this off slightly, I have found that one of the worst things about HR managers doing interviews is they never, ever, ever give any explanation of what they're actually looking for. And you ask them about it and say, well, I don't want to give them a chance to, and you're like, what do you mean? I don't want to give them a chance. We're trying to hire the person. Yeah. And the HR managers will often see it as secrets and cheating to let the candidate know what they're asking for. I think we generally don't do it as much, but
So I'll reply on that, and then maybe others have got. So my view on all this, and I've kind of come all the way around, probably first circle in all my career, which is that. So two things really is that I'm not trying to trick or trip up anybody in an interview. So I'm completely open and honest when I interview, which is so well, is that right? If we're talking about people and Scrum, I'm not going to say. My question wouldn't be to try and trick them on some sort of Scrum technique or some sort of ceremony that they may or may not be doing quite how I think it should be done. It's what I want to know is how you approach Scrum in the team that you're working about. Tell me about that. Tell me about the situations. Tell me about those things. And it's really then walking them through. Oh, we do it differently. Could you explain what the difference is? What could you trade off there? Do you understand what the differences are there? And have a conversation with them about it. And the last bit on that is, which is, I never test for what I know. I'm really interested in what the candidate knows. I have a list of things that we want to do, but actually I'm interested in what they know and how does that reflect on what I'm trying to do. So I never hire for a job. I don't go, Bob's just left, I need a new Bob. I go, people have left who were, or maybe I've got a position which is actually within a Scrum team, which is a Java developer role. I'll hire for a Java developer, but not for what the person who left did. I'm hiring for somebody who can come in and maybe add something completely different to that team, but would still have those Java skill sets. So being narrow in my mind when you interview is just basically you're automatically filtering your pool to basically that one person. And if you can find that one person, brilliant, but I can't do it.
And to add a bit on the STAR system, I usually tell people what STAR is and what the structure will be, so they know what to expect. And I mean, usually once they come up with the situation, right, that we are asking for, task, action, and result flows naturally because they did that kind of ask, that they were part of that situation. All they have to do is remember. They don't have to invent anything. And, if they invent it, it's kind of obvious anyway. And if they're good enough at inventing things that are believable and make sense technically, that's also great. So you don't have to worry about that. But I wanted to take a step back and go back to the initial question, what are you looking into in a developer? And I'll tell you something else that is a completely different take on this. And I'd like to also find out your opinion, guys. I recently sold my startup that I've been running for 5 years. And I think one of the areas that I was looking mostly in developers was passion and obviously skill. I believe that as a startup, it's extremely hard to hire novices, people who will learn over a few years and grow into great individuals. That is amazing to do. It's very hard in a startup that has to deliver immediately. So you need skilled people to make things happen, but you also need passion. And if you are a large conglomerate of sorts, you can hire some contractors where passion is not necessarily paramount. And that's how I see things, obviously. But I'd like to figure out also if you agree with this or if you have different approaches, either in startups or in enterprises.
I can probably throw a little bit of. Can you hear me all right? Sorry. I was also having some driver issues last minute. Passion is I suppose difficult to define. First of all, what is?
I'll tell you how I define it.
Yeah, let's start with that. Yeah.
So yeah, I think there are a few levels. Let's call it. It's like the worst is like a mercenary kind of contractor who doesn't care. And I mean, most of them are sometimes good developers, but they just don't give a beep, about anything. They just get the job done, and if they get a good offer, they leave. And that would be like the worst level of passion. There are people who are extremely passionate about the code that they write. They want it perfect. They spend time to be meticulous about it. Some of them have the ritual of, doing unit testing and everything. Some are optimizing the hell out of it and then figuring out the quirkiest details in the programming language. And then there is the even further, more passionate engineer that would go and try to understand the business and see how can I help? Oh, by the way, marketing is looking for this. Let me jump in and give them that information that will allow them to, target even better. Because I heard them talking over on the corridor just earlier, and I think that they are proactive. That would be the even further level of passion and commitment. And they care about business. So I think they're like, if I have to put it in 3 levels, some of them are passionate about code, which are in the middle, passionate about code and business. And then the other one is, mercenary kind of, I don't care. I do usually a good job, but I just don't care. So
Okay.
this is how I score them.
So based on that definition and my experience, I work from companies from 4 people to thousands. I would say what you really need, first of all, you need to align the role to the attitude. So for example, I've been in scenarios where you have a pragmatic tech lead who wants to stay within budget, understand the 80-20 rule, understand that you need to be willing to do commitments and to do trades off. And then you have a bunch of, most of the time, not very experienced, very passionate developers that just fights everything that the guy says. There's a constant battle for the guy to push any idea that doesn't include Kubernetes, microservices, how to scale, or anything like that. The guys are putting up together a blog. And it's just, you get into this constant kind of like impossible to move forward the design because it's just not using the ultimate tool that the X guy just learned how to use. So passion is a great thing, but it's also very dangerous, especially when the very passionate guy gets told that his stuff is not going to happen. And then that passion becomes frustration, and frustration is something that contaminates the morale of a team very quickly. So you could have had a very strong, very motivated team that looked up to this passionate guy because he had passion, and then you're actually formal team lead tries to push a different idea and it doesn't happen. So you start with like informal structures that can actually destroy the functionality of your team, because they're not going to be following the team leader anymore. They're going to be following the passionate guy who wants to push kind of like more attractive, whatever that means, technology. And you start creating this kind of like dynamics. To see what I mean? So when you have passion and power, you move things forward, but not necessarily in the right direction. So I suppose for me, the ideal scenario is actually to have a mix of people where you can always contrast the passionate guy with the non-passionate guy who is actually looking, as you say, as a mercenary. Sure, perhaps it doesn't have the heart in the team, but the mercenary doesn't want to work weekends, doesn't want to work late nights. And that means that you're gonna probably have a design that is more realistic, more feasible, and most likely it's gonna be delivered on time. So it's a very difficult thing. It's a very difficult scenario because it depends on so many variables. Again, I mean, like even the composition of your team, if you have people that are too similar to each other, how do you define leadership in that team? And it's normally the guy who shouts is the hardest. While if you have people that are given a space and approach things from different angles and different perspectives, then you're gonna have a much healthier team that's not gonna create informal leadership structures that are gonna be really bad for what you're trying to achieve, which is at the end of the day, especially in a startup, you don't want to have to micromanage everybody, because that's the reason why you don't want to be hiring very novice people, because you want things to move fast, move forward. And therefore you need to, when you create a structure of leadership, that structure of leadership has to be respected and understood. So it's just such a complicated thing, which also, I just wanted to take one little step back. I had to step out of the call for a moment, so sorry if this has been answered already, but it touches a little bit with what I heard before, is how do you judge when a person fits the company culture? Actually, how do you define company culture, and how do you judge if that person is gonna be compatible with that culture? And it kind of like, it sits very close to this whole idea of passion. Imagine that you try to put a kind of like a very passionate person in what you define as a group of mercenaries. It's just not gonna fit. But that's very different from a company culture where, I don't know, like the way that you resolve conflict, for example, for me would be a way to define company culture. But I'm just interested to hear, how do you define that in an interview, and what are you looking for?
I guess in terms of, there is a concept of a culture of growth that I would highly recommend to everybody, where, the blame is put aside and it's a question of how do you make sure this doesn't happen again, and let's learn something from this mistake. So this is an approach that is quite simple to put in practice, but it takes time to, internalize it and make sure you don't point fingers. But one other aspect in terms of, how you figure out if the guy or girl fits the culture, one rule of thumb I think about right now, but it's more of a general impression, but one rule of thumb would be, it's the person that I'd love to argue with and I will not hate afterwards, and we can have a beer and debate things without repercussions, without frustration that becomes, as you said, spreads within the team. A person that is understands some parts of the business would be great, because obviously can be convinced on the business needs, not just tech needs. Because passion, you made it earlier sound as if it's actually really bad, but I think yes, indeed, passion has to be mitigated by someone who's very pragmatic, and it's the team fit, the team culture is actually part of this, is hiring the people that would complement each other in a way. And having similar values would be great. It's hard, but it would be great. Maybe you have a smoker and people hate smokers. I don't know. That can be the most minute thing sometimes, and you have to make sure it's impossible to guarantee everything and to guarantee that people will fit well. It's a trial and error at the end of the day. You can try your best.
So how do you define company culture as a group of values?
I mean,
in
my previous company, I actually put them together. Wrote them down.
The culture is whether people can work together, work productively. I mean, that is the goal of it. And, it's so important when you're interviewing to have as many people from the team see the candidate as you realistically can. So even if you have like a session in the interview where you've got 3 people in a panel and you say, look, we're actually just going to let you meet some of the team and have an open discussion with them and find out, what they tell you about the job. So you get a sense, you get to meet the team, they get to see you. And then literally everyone has a veto, that unless everyone agrees that this candidate is good, you just pass. And that really helps lock down culture.
We do a lot of very similar things, and I'm kind of like talking to my girlfriend who was just going through some interviews with Apple. They kind of do a very similar thing as well, where you go and talk, you're literally interviewing with every single person on the team, and it kind of works that way. I think the culture fit is very important. You're kind of like looking at just generally what is the attitude and what's kind of like the direction that this person's going to be pulling the team in as well. So like, I think from our team, one of the things that we often look at is, for example, how risk adverse versus risk, kind of like risk reward profile, I guess you could say, for the person. Like, I think that that's quite important. Some people are way more cautious, and that's important to have on your team. And some people are, way more bullish. And I think kind of balancing those two tendencies can be a very, very good thing for a team dynamic. You want to have a bit of tension there so that you're always kind of like, checking yourself, but also pushing the ball forward. So I guess from my perspective, just circling back on this a little bit, if we're looking at these candidates and trying to find an excellent candidate, I guess there's the technical capabilities of this candidate, and then we're also looking at the cultural fit. And I'm kind of like, from my perspective, I'm quite interested to find out a little bit more about the technical evaluation part of this, because it seemed like we didn't necessarily come to a resolution earlier. Like we were saying, okay, situational interviewing has some perks if it's done in a very specific way, targeted to trying to find out a few key pieces of information about the candidate, but it's not a general use tool. And then, STAR method, a couple of other things. What would you guys recommend? Like, if we were to just synthesize what kind of like some of the insights from that section were, what do we think is like some of the best ways, especially for a company like in my case coming in, we don't have many programmers, or we have like very few people who are in that background base. We're much more of an engineering company. So we don't necessarily have the ability to go in and ask somebody the really technical questions without doing something that's either situational or bringing in an external third party to evaluate that.
I can talk
Curious
to
about advice on that.
my experience of what has worked for me in the past. It necessarily applies, but the main thing, as they commented before, is to align whatever you're doing with the candidate role. So if you're not gonna hire a solution architect, I don't expect the guy to be able to put together an architecture. I expect the guy to be able to understand architecture, but that's a very different skill that you cannot judge from telling the guy, make me an architecture. You know what I mean? That's not what you're hiring him for. So it's absolutely crucial to get alignment on those two aspects, which fails very often. So, I mean, I imagine that if any of you worked as a developer, at some point you were asked to invert a binomial tree in an interview for a web developer or something like that, which is just kind of like completely like displacement of something I haven't seen since uni, and like somehow I need to like train for it. It's ridiculous. You actually get worse candidates because they're for a reason, that doesn't matter. So if you start by the alignment, if you're hiring, for example, developers, for me, what has worked very well is actually to start from a very, very small area and grow as the candidate feels comfortable. So what I'm trying, just to put it in something a bit more concrete, something that works very well for, well, I consider raw developers, so someone who's there to write code, is I give them a piece of code, a code that doesn't work, and I ask him to help to fix it. So that immediately tells me, for example, first of all, it's an absolute essential skill. No matter what you do, you need to fix bugs, right? You need to understand. So it tells me if the person can debug code, stuff like that, how comfortable with certain tools. And then as the person fixes bugs, I can see whether the person naturally thought about writing tests to avoid the bug to happen again, and it starts to grow. If the person writes tests or no, we can work on that. But the important thing, if the person didn't write a test, it's not to make it a negative thing. You ask them, like, well, you have thought about writing a test. You know, I mean, like, you never guide the person to say, oh, you didn't write a test, negative mark. Absolutely not. The idea is that the person might not thought about it. Under pressure, people sometimes just forget about things, or just thought maybe like he didn't understand that the exercise was about that. So then you could ask him to write a test about it. If the test is successful, then you can ask them about change the structure of the code to perhaps like restructure in a way where maybe it was just a bunch of ugly functions making it into a nice class. That kind of thing will give you understanding of how the person is working by layers. If you can, and then the idea is that you stop at the level where you need to stop. So if the person needs to go, needs to be a team lead, for example, needs to understand a larger life cycle, you can keep growing that to packaging, to the deployment, to continuous integration, to whatever you need, and you can push it from a particular example upwards and generalize it as much as you need for the role. That has worked very well for me because it gives me two things that are important. First of all, I can guide the candidate based on their strengths, which is what I think Richard was talking, or no, Andy was saying, that you want to know what they know. You don't want to force into them what you want to hear. And then it also allows me to create as many layers as required for the role, so I can make that as generic as possible, but still very grounded in reality. So I'm not asking the person to design a parking lot or one of those silly things that sometimes you hear. So that's my experience. That's something has worked very well for me. It's conversational. It's small, but also requires a lot of technical skill, and it's pressureless, because normally when I'm asking them to fix, it's not a complicated piece of software. It's normally something like adds to number app or reads a file and writes it somewhere else, something really, really basic. And that for me works very well. I don't know, that's just my experience.
Thanks, Jorge, and thanks everyone. I'm just going to come in quickly here. We usually break to breakout rooms at this point. I'm just going to put a quick poll, because it made me think, I've never actually asked people if they'd rather do that or not. So I'm just going to launch a poll. Hopefully this is easy. You should have that come up on your screen and you can just vote. Would you like to go to breakout rooms, or would you like to stay in the main session? So breakout rooms, if you haven't done it before, is just going to be, you'll be with 3 or 4 other people. So yeah, you'll get a much smaller, more concentrated group. Whereas this, we can just stay in here and have one conversation going. So I'll go with the majority.
Are you just asking about today?
Just right now, yeah. So right now we can break right now and move into breakout rooms for the last 15 minutes, or to be honest, you can stay in there as long as you want, or you can we can stay in this one main session with everyone in it. And I'll keep going. I might ask again in 10 minutes.
Only 2 people left to vote. Only 1 person. Come on.
That's fine. Well, that's the majority is to stay in. So Jorge, as you were, if anyone would like to come back in on Jorge's point, then go ahead.
So on the technical evaluation, I always use a very rigorously scripted interview plan against the job spec. And I'm just wondering if people have any thoughts on that. Does anyone else do that, or is it crazy? Or
I don't think it's crazy, John. And I think I don't think it's crazy at all. And I think based on some of the other things that, I don't know, you mentioned this earlier, John, and a few others have, I think it's the one that gives you the most covering your arse. So at least you're judging all candidates by the same yardstick per se, compared to, you know, obviously talking about getting the whole team to meet and potentially veto. I mean, the potential political implications and the rest of that, I'm not sure I'd agree. But I think in terms of almost having that standardized bit is probably a good idea. I won't go too far though. I think it just needs to meet the purpose. And last thing you want to do is obviously give the best candidates the worst interview experience. And obviously a great candidate's going to want to obviously talk about themselves. So I'd probably keep it to as much of a minimum as possible, but at least it is giving you a consistent grading.
One question: are you guys doing technical interviews? And I'm talking about the pure technical part of the interview. Are you doing that yourselves? Do you have a senior developer or team lead of sorts involved? And you do the post that interview, a more kind of cultural fit and the general discussions, technical philosophy kind of interview afterwards? What's your approach to that?
I'll jump in, but interrupt me if you want. I don't want to speak too much. In my experience, again, it depends. So if the person's going to be working directly for me, then absolutely, I'll do it myself. If it's going to be a couple levels below me, so it's like a team with a team or something like that, it has to be that team lead, I would say, to be there. It doesn't mean I'm not going to be there. Sometimes it helps, but definitely the person who is going to be directly managing that person has to be the main person doing the interview, because at the end of the day, as you were talking about culture fit, there's also team fit, which sometimes even more important than culture. You know, like I've worked for companies, for example, that are not mainly technical based. So the technical aspect is a tool, and normally the techie guys will have a completely different culture than the rest of the company. So it's just fit for whoever's going to be working with. That's my experience in that.
I completely agree with that as well. I mean, I do a lot of technical interviews, but my view is always that if there's someone who's more qualified to do it, either because they're going to be managing the person or working more directly with them, they're probably the best person to conduct that kind of interview. And then obviously I'll take their advice and their opinion on whether they think it should be a hire at the end of the day. I've also, to kind of go one step further with this, we were interviewing in our company yesterday actually for some designers. And we had a couple of really good candidates. And one of the founders of the company said to me, do you want to, sit in on this interview? I said, well, yeah, I can sit in, but really I think the most important person to be in there should be one of our front-end developers. Let's grab the most senior front-end developer. They're going to be working very closely with this designer. Their opinion on, the way that this designer works and the way that they'll work with the development team is going to be way more, worth your while to know than my opinion on them.
I think it depends hugely on how important you think recruiting is. So like taking that example you just gave, I generally believe recruiting is one of the most important things you can possibly do at C-level. And of course, we have all the studies that show that most FTSE 100 and Fortune 500 CEOs all agree on that, and none of them actually do it. They all deprioritize it, which is hilarious. But
your 4G's
if
playing
you
up
think
again.
it's important enough, sorry, my internet connect, get as many people into that tech interview as possible. Yeah, so my minimum is to have your main stakeholder in the tech interview, and for a programming role, sometimes that's the line manager. Other times it's the senior tech lead or team lead, technical team lead for the team. Other times, so if it's a front end position and we're hiring for the most senior front end engineer, it might be the most senior back end engineer is the main person. That's normally obvious for given each role. But aside from that, if I could be in them, I would be in all of them. Again, it's the most important thing I can be doing. Unfortunately, normally that's physically impossible with the volume of interviews we're doing. However, the thing I then reserve for myself is sitting in on a tech interview or co-interviewing a tech interview is one of the most powerful ways of making sure that your incompetent interviewers, which all your engineers are by default, are actually being taught and learning to be really good interviewers, especially at technical interviews. So technical interviews are where they're in their strongest position. They know it very well. And so that's where they tend to sink into bad habits on interviewing style. So I'll normally aim to be in about 50% of those until I'm confident on a person by person basis that particular engineering interviewer is doing tech interviews well, and maybe drop back into them a quarter later, 3 months later, and drop in on a few of theirs just to make sure they're still doing it well and haven't slipped into bad habits.
So I've got a follow-up question.
I tend to ask them for a plan of the interview, especially when they're new at interviewing. I ask them to put together a plan to see how they want to conduct the interview and what they're aiming to get out of it. I think that's usually useful, and they tend to share that with other developers that will interview later. Everybody can change it, of course, but it's nice to have some sort of structure in place already.
Yeah. So I just wanted to follow up with something Adam was saying. So I totally agree. Recruiting and hiring is probably the most important thing I do, and I spend an inordinate amount of time planning, prepping, and doing it. So it's really around interview training, really. So I was interested in how many, maybe I won't ask for a show of hands, but how many people conduct interview training and actually train your teams to interview and actually have the skills to be able to interview? Or is it shadow me and watch what I do, which I wouldn't recommend anyone does, because you're probably going to pick up all my bad habits. So we do a little bit. We don't do nearly enough for what I think is a critical part of our business, but I'm interested to know.
I think that
rather do you go for training from? Like, I haven't found many organizations that would offer that service, or maybe I haven't looked yet. Like I mostly got my training and my technique from some institutions that I've worked with and some co-interviewing that I've done with people who are way more experienced than I am. But yeah, I think that's probably a good thing. Do you have anybody that you'd recommend for training?
I work for a very, very large company, so we have huge HR departments and training, and yeah, we have what we call our own university. So we actually have lots of training resources internally for it. So I kind of make sure that all of my interviewers and team attend those. Yeah.
Very difficult to do. The basics are very easy to do well, but anything beyond the basics are difficult to do, and anything advanced is very difficult to do. So unless you found an incredibly expensive and boutique training company, I would assume don't bother with paid for external training. It's not really going to do you much good. All the people who are great at it are earning large amounts of money, running large parts of organizations, because it empowers everything they do. So when Andy mentioned training, I interpreted what you were saying immediately as, internalized training rather than external paid for training. Which also gives, because I think the biggest part of it for me is that if you're going to do any training at all on recruitment, whether or not you intend this, the reality is 50% of what you're trying to do is to train the person in your culture. So you've got someone who works for you, they're in your culture, they think they understand it. But when they are recruiting, their level of understanding goes up and has to go up a lot more. Because in terms of your company recruitment, I mean, this is a quite obscure view, but every person you hire is changing your culture. So the most important time to understand your culture and to be looking after it is when you're hiring. So if you're going to do any training in recruitment, unless you're a really large organization, you probably want that training to come internally anyway, because otherwise you're not going to inject that cultural view.
You know,
that makes a lot of sense.
I find it really interesting, this this concept about this interview training. I was thinking a similar thing as you were talking, Adam, before. Like we run these aspiring groups, as you guys know, and we've got this aspiring speakers group, and we had a guy, an IBM guy, who's trained a bunch of their now conference speakers, give a 2-day workshop. And it wasn't exactly, obviously it's just a 2-day, 2-hour workshop, giving it completely for free. He's going to do it again. I bet we could do this through the London CTOs or CTO Craft or something where we can just pull people together a bit like this, maybe in small groups or something like that, maybe even get some mock interviews going or something. I don't quite know what it would look like, but if anyone's interested in pursuing it as an idea, whether it's a roundtable like this, where it's just a case of sharing ideas, or whether it's a bit more of a workshop. I mean, like someone like yourself, Adam, you've put together a book. We're working on a book around recruiting, right? Like to have, we've got some insane resources and contacts, people within this group that we can bring together. And I'm sure, you know, I'm sure if you're saying, Corley, you're asking where you can get it from, and there's no clear, you know, this is the course to go on, this is the thing to do. Maybe there's no one right way, but at least a chance to speak to people that have a lot of experience, have tried and tested. I don't know.
I think Adam's answer resonated a lot.
I'd say there's two halves
of the culture part of it, but I think also, you know, I guess there's two parts, right? Because just like the basics of interviewing, which is, you know, eliminating bias from your process, bringing on people who are, you know, diverse and filling the needs, and not necessarily, you know, homogeneous group of people, but also fitting with the culture. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
So I think you can do a lot of you know, workshops around basics. Get people to come along and just practice it. And then I think the advanced stuff you're looking at, it's more gap gas. It's, you know, run an open session, like an office hours style thing, where you say, you've got a problem, come along, we'll talk about it with other people. Everyone will share their problems and share their potential solutions. Because the more advanced and harder stuff, it's so unique per organization. You can't really, I mean, I'm sure you can turn it into training. I've turned harder things into training, but I think it'd be a huge amount of effort. And so it'd be easier at that point to do it in this kind of roundtable format, where you're just saying, yeah, you know, come along and talk about it and see what response you get. But I think the basics are all entirely trainable and should be.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of horrific interviewing that goes on, because obviously we get to see it, and we get to see all the false positives and the false negatives that one company makes, and where that candidate ends up, and all that kind of thing. And it's obviously, you know, we're not in a position to we're not technical interviewers ourselves, we're not CTOs, so we can only say so much. But no, it's an interesting space. Adam, I'm gonna talk to you afterwards about this and see where it goes. Guys, we're on the hour mark. I don't mind leaving the camera rolling if people want to. I don't mind moving to break rooms if people want to, but I'm getting the impression that's not popular. Do you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to hit the breakout room button. And if you want to stay and you want to keep talking, feel free. But obviously there's no pressure to.
We'll probably end up in the same amount of break with the people in the same break room. There's very little people on the actual course still, isn't there? So we'll probably all just end up in the same break room or something.
It's true. So I've also put a little Google Doc there. Richard reminded me of something I wanted to do. So if you want to put your email or your LinkedIn or any contact details and share details with everyone on the call, then please do. And one other little mention for CTO Craft. If you're not on CTO Craft, then jump on it. It's a great resource run by Andy Skipper, and it's hugely popular Slack group, and we've got loads of resources there. So yeah, something we'd recommend for all CTOs. But with that, I hope you've all had a good time. I'm gonna hit the breakout rooms button. Hope you enjoy it, and I'll see you soon.
Thanks, guys.
Cheers.
Cheers, bye.
Cheers, guys.
Cheers, everyone.